I was arranging fresh lilies in the crystal vase my mother gave me 30 years ago when the doorbell rang, and something in the way it sounded, sharp, insistent, almost aggressive, made my hands freeze mid-motion, the water from the stems dripping onto the marble countertop in slow, deliberate drops that seemed to count down to something I didn't know was coming. I wiped my hands on the linen towel, walked through the hallway where 30 years of family photos hung like a museum of a life I thought was real, and opened the door to find a woman I had never seen before standing on my porch in a red dress that was far too tight and far too young for the neighborhood. Her blonde hair professionally styled, her makeup applied with the precision of someone who spends a lot of time looking in mirrors, and her eyes, those cold, calculating blue eyes, looking at me with a mixture of pity and triumph that made my stomach turn. She didn't introduce herself, didn't apologize for the intrusion, didn't even wait for me to speak before she said in a voice that dripped with false sweetness, "You must be Catherine, Richard's wife, or should I say ex-wife, because he's mine now. He's been mine for 2 years, and I'm here to tell you that you've lost. You can stop trying to hold on to him, stop calling him, stop pretending you still have a marriage, because what we have is real. What you had was just an arrangement, a comfortable lie that lasted too long." I stood there in the doorway of my own home, the home I had decorated, maintained, filled with love and memories for 3 decades, and I looked at this stranger who had just declared war on my life with such casual cruelty, and I felt something I hadn't felt in a very long time. Not anger, not sadness, but a cold, crystalline clarity that cut through every emotion like a knife through silk. I smiled at her, a real smile that reached my eyes, and I said in the calmest voice I had ever used, "Please come in, there's something you should see." And the confusion that flickered across her face was delicious because she had expected tears, she had expected rage, she had expected me to fall apart, but instead I was inviting her into my home as if she were a guest I had been expecting. She hesitated for just a moment, her confidence wavering, but her arrogance won out, and she stepped across the threshold with the clicking of her expensive heels on the hardwood floor, and I led her to the living room where the afternoon sun was streaming through the windows, illuminating the space where Richard and I had spent countless evenings, where we had raised our daughter, where we had built what I thought was a life. I gestured for her to sit on the sofa, but I remained standing, and I walked to the antique writing desk in the corner, the one that had belonged to Richard's grandmother, and I opened the middle drawer and pulled out a golden manila envelope that had been sitting there for exactly 3 months, waiting for this exact moment. I held it in my hands for just a second, feeling the weight of everything it contained. The truth, the evidence, the end of one life and the beginning of another. And then I walked back to where she sat looking at me with increasing confusion and handed it to her with a grace that surprised even me. "What is this?" she asked, her voice losing some of its earlier confidence, her fingers touching the envelope as if it might burn her. "Open it," I said simply, and I sat down in the chair across from her, crossed my legs, folded my hands in my lap, and waited with the patience of someone who has already won. She opened the envelope, pulled out the thick stack of papers inside, and began to read, and I watched as her face transformed from confused to shocked to pale to absolutely devastated in the space of about 90 seconds, her hands starting to tremble, her breath coming faster, her eyes scanning the words over and over as if reading them again would change what they said. This can't be," she stammered, looking up at me with eyes that were no longer cold and calculating but wide with panic. "It's a prenuptial agreement," I said calmly. "The one Richard signed when we got married 30 years ago, long before his family's software company went public, long before he was worth anything, and as you can see, it's ironclad, which means that in the event of a divorce caused by infidelity, his infidelity specifically, he gets nothing, I get everything, the house, the vacation properties, the investment accounts, the stock portfolio, everything we built together becomes mine and mine. Alone." I watched her process this information, watched her realize that the man she thought she was winning was actually a prize that came with absolutely nothing attached. "But that's not all," I continued, my voice still perfectly calm, perfectly measured, enjoying every second of her discomfort. "You see, Richard has been very sloppy with his affair, very careless, and over the past 6 months I've documented everything. The hotel receipts I found in his jacket pockets, the credit card statements showing jewelry purchases I never received, the text messages he forgot to delete, the emails, the photos, all of it, and my lawyer has assured me that with this level Of evidence, the divorce will be swift, decisive, and absolutely in my favor. She was shaking now, the papers falling from her hands onto the coffee table, her carefully applied makeup starting to crack as the reality of what she had walked into sank in. "So you see," I said, leaning forward slightly, "when you said he's yours now, you were absolutely right. Congratulations, you've won him, you get Richard, but what you're getting is a 62-year-old man with a bad back, high cholesterol, a tendency to snore like a freight train, and after our divorce is finalized in about 60 days, absolutely no money, no assets, no properties, nothing but the clothes on his back and a mountain of debt, because he'll have to pay my legal fees on top of his own." The color had completely drained from her face now, and I could see her mind working, calculating, realizing that she had been played, that she had invested 2 years into a man she thought was wealthy and powerful, but who was about to become neither. "There's one more thing," I said, reaching into the envelope and pulling out a smaller document. "This is a lease agreement for the apartment Richard's been keeping for you on 5th Avenue. The one he's been paying for with our joint credit card. The one that costs $8,000 a month, and as of next week when our accounts are separated, he won't be able to pay for it anymore, which means you'll need to find somewhere else to live. Unless of course you can afford it yourself, which I'm guessing you can't. Based on the fact that you haven't worked a real job in 2 years. I stood up then, smoothed my skirt, and walked to the door, opening it in a clear invitation for her to leave. "I would wish you luck," I said as she stumbled to her feet, gathering the papers with shaking hands, her red dress suddenly looking cheap and desperate in the afternoon light. "But honestly, I think you're going to need much more than luck. You're going to need a plan, a job, and probably a new target, because Richard is about to become the worst investment you ever made." She walked past me without a word, her heels clicking frantically on the floor, and I closed the door behind her with a soft, final click that sounded like the period at the end of a very long sentence. I walked back to the kitchen, picked up the lilies I had been arranging, and continued my work as if nothing had happened, because in a way, nothing had. I had simply taken out the trash. The truth was, I had known about Richard's affair for exactly 7 months, 2 weeks, and 3 days. I had known from the moment I found the first receipt. But unlike the woman who just left my house, I didn't react with emotion. I didn't scream or cry or confront him immediately. Instead, I did something much more powerful. I planned. I called my lawyer, the best divorce attorney in the state, a woman named Margaret Chun who had a reputation for destroying unfaithful husbands in court with the precision of a surgeon and the mercy of an executioner, and I laid out everything I knew, everything I suspected, and everything I wanted to achieve. "Give me 6 months," Margaret had said, her eyes gleaming with the thrill of a challenge, her fingers drumming on her mahogany desk in a rhythm that sounded like a war march. 6 months to build a case so airtight that he won't even think about fighting it. 6 months to document every lie, every transaction, every moment of betrayal until we have enough evidence to bury him so deep he'll need a ladder to see rock bottom. So I gave her 6 months, and during that time I became the perfect wife. I cooked Richard's favorite meals. I asked about his day with genuine-sounding interest. I smiled when he came home late smelling of perfume that wasn't mine. I even suggested we plan a vacation together knowing full well we would never take it. I attended his business dinners and laughed at his colleagues' jokes, and played the role of the devoted spouse, so convincingly that even I sometimes forgot I was acting. Every lie he told me, I documented in a small leather notebook I kept hidden in my closet. Every unexplained expense I photographed with my phone and uploaded to a secure cloud account. Every late night at the office I verified with his secretary Sarah, who, it turned out, couldn't stand him and was more than happy to provide me with detailed records of his actual schedule versus the one he told me about, because apparently Richard had made the mistake of treating her like an invisible piece of furniture rather than a human being with eyes and ears and a very good memory. Margaret worked her magic behind the scenes, gathering evidence like a detective, filing preliminary paperwork that Richard would never see until it was too late, preparing for the battle that Richard didn't even know was coming, hiring a private investigator named David who followed Richard to restaurants and hotels and the 5th Avenue apartment I didn't know existed, who took photographs that made my stomach turn but that I forced myself to look at anyway because I needed to see the truth. With my own eyes, who documented every kiss, every embrace, every moment of betrayal with the cold objectivity of a professional. 3 months ago, everything was ready, the evidence was overwhelming, the prenup was verified, the strategy was set, and Margaret called me into her office and spread everything across her conference table like a general displaying the spoils of war before the battle had even begun. "The prenup is your nuclear option," Margaret had explained, her perfectly manicured finger tapping on the document that would change my life. He signed it when he was 28 years old, broke, and in love, probably never read it carefully, certainly never imagined it would matter because young people in love never think about divorce. But it's legal, it's binding. It's been properly maintained and updated according to state law, and it's going to destroy him completely and utterly. Destroy him. I had smiled at that, not with joy but with the satisfaction of knowing that the man who had betrayed me, who had lied to me every single day for 2 years, who had made a fool of me with a woman half his age while I was home preparing his dinner and managing his household and being faithful, was about to learn that actions have consequences, that betrayal has a price, and that underestimating your wife is the most expensive mistake a man can make. The day after the mistress's visit, Richard came home early, which was unusual because his pattern had been to stay late at the office, which really meant staying late with her, and I knew immediately that she had called him, had told him about our conversation, had probably screamed at him for being a liar and a fraud and for promising her a life of luxury that was about to evaporate like morning mist. He walked into the kitchen where I was preparing dinner. Chicken piccata with lemon and capers, his absolute favorite, the dish I had perfected over 30 years of marriage. And he looked at me with an expression I had never seen before on his face, a mixture of fear and anger, and something that might have been shame, but probably wasn't because men like Richard rarely feel shame, they feel inconvenienced. "Catherine," he started, his voice uncertain, his hands shaking slightly as he loosened his tie. "I heard you had a visitor today." I looked up from the cutting board where I was slicing lemons with a knife that caught the light and gleamed like a promise, my movements precise and even, and I smiled at him with the same warmth I had shown him every day for 3 decades. "Oh yes, your girlfriend, charming woman, lovely dress, terrible manners, but we had a very interesting conversation." His face went pale, the color draining so quickly I thought he might actually faint, and he gripped the edge of the counter for support. "What did you tell her?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. I set down the knife, wiped my hands on the towel with careful deliberation, and turned to face him fully, giving him my complete attention for what I knew would be one of the last real conversations we would ever have. "I told her the truth, Richard. I told her that you're about to lose everything, that our prenuptial agreement is ironclad, that I've documented your affair in excruciating detail with photographs and receipts and witness testimony, and that in about 8 weeks you're going to be a divorced man with no money, no house, no vacation properties, no investment portfolio, and no prospects for the future beyond whatever salary your company still decides to pay you after they find out you've been using company credit cards to fund your affair." The silence that followed was so complete I could hear the kitchen clock ticking, could hear his breathing get faster and more shallow, could hear the chicken sizzling in the pan, could almost hear his mind racing through options and scenarios and escape routes that didn't exist because I had blocked them all. "You can't do this," he finally said, his voice rising with panic, his hands gesturing wildly. "We built this life together. You can't just take everything. It's not fair. I made mistakes, but that doesn't mean you get to destroy me. We can work this out. We can go to counseling. I'll end it with her. I promise, please, Catherine. We've been together for 30 years. That has to count for something." I laughed then, a Real laugh that came from deep in my chest, from a place I didn't even know existed, and it felt so good, so liberating, so absolutely perfect that I laughed harder, until tears streamed down my face and my sides hurt, and Richard was staring at me as if I had completely lost my mind, which in a way I had lost the mind that cared about his feelings, the mind that would sacrifice my own happiness for his comfort, the mind that believed marriage meant accepting betrayal. With grace. "We built this life together," I repeated when I could finally speak, wiping tears from my eyes. "Richard, let me tell you about how we built this life. I built this life. I decorated this house room by room with furniture I selected and arranged. I raised our daughter Emma while you were at the office building your career. I hosted your business dinners and smiled at your boring colleagues and laughed at their inappropriate jokes. I supported your career moves and relocated 3 times for your promotions. I managed this. household and paid the bills and organized the vacations and remembered everyone's birthdays. I was faithful, I was loyal, I was everything a wife should be. And you threw it all away for a woman young enough to be your daughter, a woman who was only with you because she thought you were rich and powerful. And now she knows the truth, and I'm guessing she's already looking for her next target, because women like that don't stick around when the money runs out. He tried to argue, tried to justify, tried to tell me it was a mistake, that he loved me, that she meant nothing, that it was a midlife crisis, that he was confused, all the clichés that cheating husbands use when they're caught and desperate, all the tired excuses that might have worked on a different woman but would never work on me because I was done, completely and utterly done with his lies. I don't care, I said, cutting him off mid-sentence, holding up my hand in a gesture that silenced him immediately. I don't care why you did it, I don't care how it started, I don't care if you're sorry, I don't care if you regret it, because none of that changes the facts. You cheated, you lied, you betrayed me, you made a mockery of our marriage, and now you're going to pay for it in the only way that seems to matter to men like you. Financially, publicly, and completely. He left the kitchen without eating dinner, without another word, and I heard him upstairs packing a bag, heard drawers slamming and closet doors banging, heard him making phone calls in hushed, desperate tones, probably to his lawyer, probably to his mistress, probably to his brother James, who had money and might bail him out. Though I doubted James would help once he found out what Richard had done, because James had always liked me and had warned Richard years ago not to take me for granted. I finished cooking the chicken piccata even though I was the only one who would eat it, because I refused to let his crisis interrupt my routine, refused to let his panic disturb my peace, refused to give him the satisfaction of seeing me rattled or upset, or anything other than completely calm and in control. When he came back downstairs 45 minutes later with his suitcase and his garment bag and his laptop case, I was sitting at the dining table with a glass of Chardonnay and a plate of perfectly cooked chicken, and I looked at him with the same polite interest I might give a stranger passing on the street. "Where will you go?" I asked, not because I cared, not because I was concerned, but because I was genuinely curious about what his plan was. "A hotel," he muttered, not meeting my eyes, staring at the floor like a guilty child. "The Marriott downtown. My lawyer says I should move out, that it looks better for the case, that judges don't like it when the husband stays in the marital home during divorce proceedings." I nodded, took a sip of my wine, savored the crisp taste of it, and said, "That's probably wise. Your lawyer sounds smart. Tell him that my lawyer will be in touch next week with the official filing. And Richard?" He stopped at the door, his hand on the handle, his back to me, his shoulders slumped in defeat. "Next time you fall in love, maybe check the prenup first, and maybe choose someone who actually loves you instead of your bank account, though I suppose at this point that won't be much of an issue." The door closed behind him, and I sat alone in the house that was now truly mine, in the silence that felt like freedom, and I raised my glass in a toast to myself, to the woman I had become, to the strength I didn't know I had. The divorce proceedings were exactly as swift and decisive as Margaret had promised. Richard tried to fight it at first, hired an expensive lawyer named Robert Garrison, who had a reputation for protecting wealthy husbands in messy divorces. A man who blustered and threatened and tried to find loopholes in the prenup, who argued that 30 years was too long for a prenup to remain valid, that I had known about the affair and condoned it through my silence, that I was mentally unstable and vindictive and trying to destroy Richard out of spite. But Margaret destroyed them at every turn, presenting evidence that was so overwhelming, so meticulously documented, so absolutely damning that even Robert Garrison eventually pulled Richard aside and advised him to settle, because fighting would only cost more money and result in the exact same outcome. The settlement hearing was held on a cold Tuesday morning in November, in a courtroom that smelled of old wood and broken promises, and I sat next to Margaret in my navy blue suit with my hands folded calmly in my lap, while Richard sat across the aisle looking like he had aged 10 years in 8 weeks, his hair grayer, his face more lined, his expensive suit hanging off him as if he had lost weight. The judge, a woman named Patricia Rodriguez who had a reputation for not tolerating nonsense, reviewed the evidence with meticulous attention, asked pointed questions about the prenup and the documentation of the affair, and finally looked at Richard with an expression of thinly veiled contempt and asked, "Mr. Harrison, do you have any objection to the proposed settlement?" Richard's lawyer started to speak, but Richard waved him off and said in a voice barely audible, "No, Your Honor, no objections." Judge Rodriguez signed the papers, declared us legally divorced, and it was over. 30 years of marriage ended with the stroke of a pen, and I felt nothing, no relief, no sadness, no joy, just a quiet sense of completion. The settlement was beautiful in its simplicity and brutal in its execution. I got the house worth $3 million, the vacation home in Aspen worth $1.5 million, the beach condo in Miami worth $800,000, 70% of the investment portfolio worth approximately $4 million, the vintage Mercedes his father had given us as a wedding present, full ownership of my interior design business, which I had built from nothing while he was busy building his affair, and which was now worth close to $2 million, and the art collection we had accumulated over 30 years, which had been appraised at $600,000. Richard got his clothes, his golf clubs, his collection of vintage watches, which turned out to be mostly fakes, worth a total of about $12,000, a small pension from his company that would pay him approximately $3,000 a month before taxes, and a court order to pay my legal fees, which totaled $98,000. The day the divorce was finalized, I didn't celebrate, didn't throw a party, didn't post anything on social media, didn't call friends to announce my freedom. I simply went home, changed into comfortable clothes, made myself a cup of tea, and sat on the terrace watching the sun set over the city, and started planning the next chapter of my life. The chapter where I was no longer defined by being someone's wife, someone's mother, someone's support system, but simply Catherine, a 68-year-old woman who had survived betrayal and come out stronger, richer, and finally free. 3 months after the divorce, I was having coffee with my daughter Emma at a cafe downtown, one of those trendy places with exposed brick and succulents in mason jars, when I saw him, Richard, walking down the street with the blonde woman from the red dress, except she wasn't wearing designer clothes anymore, wasn't dripping with jewelry, wasn't looking like someone who had won the lottery. Instead, she was in jeans and a t-shirt that had seen better days, her hair pulled back in a messy ponytail, her face free of the heavy makeup, and she looked tired, worn down, disappointed with how her fairy tale had turned out. Richard looked even worse, older, tired, defeated, wearing a jacket I didn't recognize that looked cheap, walking with his shoulders hunched as if the weight of his choices was physically pressing down on him. They were arguing about something. I could see it in their body language, the way she was gesturing angrily and he was trying to placate her with his hands raised in defense, the way she kept pointing at a store window, probably at something she wanted that he couldn't afford. And he kept shaking his head with an expression that said he was tired of having this conversation, tired of being the disappointment, tired of being the man who couldn't provide the life he had promised. I felt nothing watching them, no anger, no satisfaction, no regret, no vindication, just a mild curiosity about how long it would last before she left him for someone with better prospects, someone who could afford the Fifth Avenue apartment and the designer dresses and the lifestyle she thought she deserved. Emma saw them too and tensed beside me, her hand tightening on her coffee cup, her jaw clenching with anger on my behalf, ready to march over there and give them both a piece of her mind, but I put my hand on hers and shook my head gently. "Let it go, sweetheart, they're not worth our energy, they're not worth our time, they're not worth a single second of our attention." She looked at me with such pride and love in her eyes that I almost cried, almost let the tears fall. But I didn't, because I had done enough crying over Richard, had wasted enough emotions on a man who didn't deserve them. "Mom," Emma said softly, reaching across the table to take both my hands in hers. "I'm so proud of you, the way you handled everything, the way you didn't let him destroy you, the way you fought back with intelligence instead of emotion, the way you turned his betrayal into your liberation. You're my hero." I squeezed her hands and smiled, a real smile, the kind that reaches your eyes and warms your whole face, and comes from a place of genuine happiness. "I learned something important, Emma, something I wish I had known 30 years ago. I learned that the best revenge isn't screaming or crying or making a scene. The best revenge is planning, is being smart, is hitting them where it really hurts, is taking back your power, and then walking away with your dignity intact and your bank account full." We finished our coffee, paid the bill, left a generous tip for the waitress who had been attentive and kind, and walked out of the cafe past Richard and his girlfriend, who were still arguing on the sidewalk about something that didn't matter, and as we passed within 5 feet of them, Richard saw me, and our eyes met for just a second, maybe less, just a brief moment of connection, and in that second I saw everything I needed to see: regret, shame, the dawning realization that he had traded a woman who genuinely loved him for a woman who loved his money, and now that the money was gone, he had nothing: no wife, no home, no security, no future, just a girlfriend who was already looking for the exit, and a life he had destroyed with his own hands. I didn't stop, didn't speak, didn't acknowledge him beyond that brief moment of eye contact. I just kept walking with my daughter, my arm linked through hers, heading toward the car, toward lunch at a nice restaurant, toward the rest of my life that stretched out before me full of possibilities and free from the weight of a man who had proven himself unworthy of my love, my loyalty, my sacrifice. That night, sitting in my beautiful home that was now fully and completely mine, drinking wine on the terrace as the sun set over the city in shades of orange and pink and purple, I thought about the golden envelope, about how a simple piece of paper signed 30 years ago by a young man who never imagined he would need to worry about prenups had become the instrument of his own downfall, the weapon that had given me back my life. I thought about the blonde woman in the red dress who had knocked on my door so confidently just 4 months ago, so certain of her victory, so sure that she had won some kind of prize, only to discover that she had actually won nothing more than a broke, disgraced man with no prospects and a reputation as a cheater that would follow him for the rest of his life. I thought about all the women who find themselves in my situation every single day, who discover that their husbands have been lying, cheating, betraying them, who feel powerless, who feel like victims, who don't know that they have options, that they have power, that they can fight back and win if they're smart about it, if they plan carefully, if they document everything, if they find a good lawyer and refuse to be intimidated. And I realized that my story wasn't just about revenge, wasn't just about a prenup and a divorce and a cheating husband getting what he deserved. It was about something bigger, something more important. It was about refusing to be destroyed by someone else's choices, about taking control of your own narrative, about understanding that the end of one chapter is simply the beginning of another, and that sometimes the best thing that can happen to you is the thing you were most afraid of. The golden envelope had been my weapon, my shield, my ticket to freedom, but the real power hadn't been in the envelope at all, hadn't been in the prenup or the evidence or even the brilliant legal strategy. The real power had been in me, in my refusal to be broken, in my willingness to plan and wait and strike when the moment was right, in my understanding that dignity and strategy are far more powerful than tears and tantrums, in my decision to value myself more than I valued a marriage that had become a lie. 6 months after the divorce was finalized, I sold the interior design business for a sum that made even Margaret gasp. $2.4 million to a young entrepreneur who had been trying to break into the luxury market and saw my client list and reputation as the perfect foundation. And I took that money and invested it carefully in a diversified portfolio that would ensure I never had to worry about finances again, that would fund whatever adventures I wanted to pursue, that would be there for Emma and eventually for grandchildren I hoped to have someday. And then I did something I had dreamed about for 30 years, but never had the courage to do, something I had always wanted, but always put off because Richard didn't like travel, didn't like being away from his routine, didn't want to spend the money on what he called frivolous adventures. I bought a first-class ticket to Paris, packed a single suitcase with comfortable clothes and good walking shoes, and left for a month-long solo adventure that was just for me. No husband to please, no schedule to keep, no one to answer to accept myself, no one to tell me we couldn't afford it or we didn't have time or maybe next year. Standing on the balcony of my hotel room overlooking the Seine, watching the lights of the Eiffel Tower sparkle against the night sky like diamonds scattered across black velvet, listening to the sounds of the city below, the laughter and music and life happening all around me, I raised a glass of champagne. Real French champagne that cost more than I would have ever allowed myself to spend when I was married, to the woman I used to be, the woman who had stood at her door 7 months ago and faced her husband's mistress with grace and power and perfect control, and I whispered to the Paris night, to the stars that looked down on me with what might have been approval. Thank you for being strong enough to save me. Thank you for not breaking. Thank you for fighting back. Thank you for knowing your worth. And somewhere across the ocean, in a city I no longer called home, in a cheap apartment he could barely afford, Richard was probably lying awake at 3 in the morning wondering how everything had gone so wrong, how he had lost everything that mattered, how the woman he had underestimated and taken for granted and betrayed had become the architect of his complete and total destruction. And the answer was simple, so simple that even a child could understand it. He had forgotten that the quietest women are often the most dangerous, that the wives who smile and nod and say nothing are often the ones who are planning everything, that patience is a weapon more powerful than rage, and that a golden envelope delivered at exactly the right moment can change the course of a life forever, can end one story and begin another, can close a door on betrayal and open a window on freedom that smells like French perfume and tastes like champagne and feels like the first day of a life that finally belongs only to you. Did you like my story? And which city are you listening from? Let's meet in the comments. Don't forget to subscribe. See you in the next life story. With love and respect.